Well, welcome. I believe it's now officially spring, so our spring MSREI meeting tonight. And it's really a privilege for us to have our guest take time out of his busy schedule to enlighten us tonight. And I want to give you a little background. I think number one is that I'm so thrilled everyone was able to take time out of your days and evenings, and we try to make your time at our meetings really constructive, informative, and worthwhile, you taking the time away from your family and other things that you do in your lives beyond all the hard work you do for your patients and the research that you do. But tonight, I want to introduce to you our guest, Dr. Michael Tucker. And Michael flew up today from Atlanta. And I want to give you a little background. Many of you may be familiar with him. Not that anything he's done has gone viral on the internet or anything, but otherwise. But he's really received recognition around the planet for a lot of his pioneering work at IVF technologies. And he's helped revolutionize the treatment of infertility in so many ways. He's worked in the field of reproductive medicine and embryology for the last 26 years, or as he might say, who's counting. And he's received his undergraduate degree in zoology. And so much of what we've done has really come from animal husbandry. In fact, most everything, I believe. And in physiology, University of London, and his doctorate in reproductive physiology from the University of Birmingham. Not in Michigan or Alabama, but in the UK. And he does postdoc work at the University of Adelaide Department of Animal Sciences. He's done research from the UK to Hong Kong and circled the globe to wind up in the US. So he crossed the pond, and he's been director at Shady Grove Infertility in Rockville, Maryland. But he reaches out throughout our community in this country and overseas in so many ways. He's recognized for his pioneering work in IVF technologies, and in the area of ICSI, really at least has been attributed to the birth of the first baby through intracytoplasmic sperm injection, or ICSI. That was back over 2 decades ago, back in '92. And also the first baby born in the U.S. in from egg freezing, thawing, back in '97. So with an amazing amount of awe and admiration, but also he's been a friend and a colleague for 2 decades personally, a bit of my mentor and guru, and he always shrugs his shoulders when I say that, but truly, Mike Tucker is an amazing person who's really helped us all be better at what we do. So with great gratitude and a lot of excitement, I introduce you to Mike Tucker. Michael.
Whew. That made me sweat. That's why the jacket had to go. Even though I'm up here in Michigan and was expecting it to be much, much cooler. But thank you for that overblown intro. And yeah, I think you're just speaking about first in the US, which I know many of you have a perspective that that's the whole world, but maybe not so much. But there's some convoluted stories which I won't go into about all that. But tonight, and if I'm not talking loudly enough, I'll go back and hit this thing if you like, but I'll just try and project because I'll probably walk around quite a bit. But I'd just like to cover a pet area of in vitro fertilization this evening, which has fascinated me ever since my very first, very lame attempts to freeze human embryos back in 1984. So I first got into IVF in 1983, so it's over 30 years now, but who is counting? It's been a fun ride. But tonight's topic is going to revolve around, and I think I texted Mike Merselbarg on Friday saying, so what was I supposed to talk about tonight? So I sort of made this up on the fly coming up on the plane today, so we'll just see how it works out, okay? But essentially, it's me pontificating on how profound an impact vitrification has had and is going to have in the future practice of how we undertake IVF. And as usual, it will be my roller coaster ride through a bunch of unsubstantiated data and even comments on my part. And you can take with a pinch of salt or not. And unfortunately, there being no cocktails tonight, you may all be a little bit more discerning, which is a great shame. So there's no hiding. And I won't be half as funny without my standard gin and tonic before the talk. So. Okay, what are we talking about? Quick disclosures. I'm associated as sort of owner in these various companies, so there's a little bit of financial incentive for me to lie, but of course I never would. But let's talk about me, okay? Let's not talk about our industry. Well, except that I've been in it for 30 years, and that's what matters. I'm self-employed, PhD. I'm very grateful to an extensive professional family. But more importantly, compared to where I started out in the wild, wild west of the early 80s in IVF, become increasingly conservative, diminished drive to publish. That's why you don't see my name so much. And certainly increased drive to go out and drink beers with my dog in the backyard. But okay, let's get to the crux of the matter. Let's focus on a few learning objectives, and there won't be any post-lecture tests or anything, but you know, I thought I'd throw this in because it does sort of cover what I'm talking about. General perspective of cryo in ART. Don't you love acronyms in our industry? Current technology, certainly vitrification as far as I'm concerned, suitable uses for cryo and how they're expanding. And certainly we'll touch on some of the risks as well as benefits of cryo in our industry. A little bit more focus on what I want to say tonight, and if you don't read any other slide or listen to me for the rest of your meal, simply that vitrification, from my perspective, has heralded a whole new potential of positivity in how I and we can operate in IVF therapy. Certainly elective single embryo transfer is a much easier sell to patients. Simply, if you can convince a patient that you can vitrify that second or even third blastocyst and have just as pretty much good chance, if not maybe even better in an FET, more natural cycle, then why risk the potential for twins or worse? So that's a big deal for having effective cryopreservation. Certainly therapy can be put on ice at any stage, from the egg all the way through to the blastocyst stage. And while some of my docs, I think we had a call last month where one of the patients decided that she had some potential to go and have this plastic surgery instead of coming in for IVF transfer because she'd taken so long to hook up with this particular plastic surgeon. She decided that she wanted to cancel her transfer and have her embryos vitrified. So we're getting a little whimsical, and the doc said yes, and it's like, holy cow, okay. I'm not recommending that we get that whimsical in the approach of cryo, but certainly the ability for us to certainly say, you know, we've had husbands have an accident on the way to come in and produce samples. We've vitrified all the eggs. You get the idea. Anyway, so it's not such a big issue. Embryo donation is certainly a much better bet than for many years of freezing. Rather, I know a lot of us got to be quite good with slow freezing of blastocysts, but certainly there are many earlier stage slow frozen embryos that really aren't worth the effort to go through the thaw and transfer into highly expectant recipient embryo donor recipients. So I feel that vitrification gives you a much better bet there. In general, efficiencies of therapy overall per embryo generated are higher. And certainly although I'm not a massive fan of over-promoting PGS in particular, complete chromosomal screening, whatever acronym you wish to choose, certainly from my perspective, I don't try to struggle with overnight screening for aneuploidy to get a day 6 transfer, because I quite happen to think that day FET transfers are probably preferable, give you the opportunity to gather all your embryo information in terms of euploidy status before you actually get to an FET transfer. Enough of that. This is a ridiculously silly slide, but just shows you the kind of scale of operations at the main lab in Rockville in Maryland over these 13 years, and it gives you sort of an idea of the scale of operations with over 35,000 cycles initiated. So it kind of gives you the potential, and that's the only figure that's of any interest in that slide, but it does give you the ability to come up with some nice graphics which you can, you know, take to the bank, as they say, in terms of counseling your patients what valid expectations or otherwise are, either by age or the number of cycles relative to one's age. And you know, these not super clever slides, but certainly interesting slides like this, for example, which has a breakdown of multiple pregnancies relative to maternal age down here, running up to, as you'll see in the over 40 group, and indeed in the 38 to 40 group, that triplet pregnancy delivery rates is actually higher than in the younger groups. And what that says is that since we've transitioned much more to extended culture routinely for blastocyst transfer, it's like we're screwing it up with a lot of these older women, because if we have a couple of kick-ass blastocysts, or even 3 or so, just because she's 42, don't necessarily put back 2, or certainly don't put back 3, because if you've done a good job culturing out to that stage and you've got good looking blastocysts, you'll get bit in the tush with some higher rates of multiple pregnancies. So we're scaling back certainly the number of embryos we put back even in our older patients, with the provision that principally we're driving to more routine day 5 transfers. And by that I don't necessarily mean just blastocysts. I mean, even if it's developed from day 2 onwards and you've got something that's compacted, morulated, it's limping along, but hatch it and put it back on your 42-year-old on day 5, and you may want to put back 3 morula by that point. This is an interesting slide, which actually shows you that once we crunch the numbers, looking at historic cryo data from 2009 versus 2012, when we had transitioned much more to the use of vitrified blastocysts, we certainly saw a very nice uptick in our overall cryo outcome. So this is sort of the crux of my talk. But that said, having started in IVF in the end of '83, 2014 is certainly looking very different to even as recently as 1994, when so much more has come into play in our area of operations. But let's focus on vitrification being the game changer here. I've kind of covered this already, but the standard focus it has shifted away from multiple embryo transfer to the attempt of achieving just a single embryo as being the true successful criterion in our business. And I say from very personal experience that down here I have a set of twin sisters who are 4 years older than me, and I have several scars on my face to prove how brutal twins can be. I could have managed one sister 4 years older than me, but not 2. So I have a vested interest in minimizing multiple pregnancies. It's tough on us younger Sims. So see how we've had an impact in that arena in our clinic at Shady Grove. You'll see that there's funky bars, but the kind of the purpley ones are the donor egg transfers, the application of single embryo transfer, and the orangey bars are within the autologous population. And this is, you know, a long way from 2002, when I had screaming matches with Bob Stillman at Shady Grove over him pushing the elective single embryo transfer program. Of course, as any good embryologist would want, we would want to keep our pregnancy rates up. So I was always painfully fearful of dropping from 2 and 3 blast transfers routinely down to just single. But he prevailed, we prevailed, and I think we do a very good job at pushing that area of therapy. And it's principally thanks due to the ability to run good extended culture with blast transfer. But here, just from 2011 data, shows you the sort of impact, how we've managed to push that area of ops compared with national SART-based data based on 2011. Okay, all good stuff, but let's just sort of take a little sobering look back to this. This was an abstract presented, or a couple of abstracts at ASRM 2010, where we crunched a bit of data, 14,500 cycles of IVF with 92,000 plus oocytes, all maturity, and basically came up with a formula to say how many eggs does it take to collect to actually end up with a live-born baby. And back then, albeit on data solely through 2008, the efficiencies were very interesting because for every 100 eggs that you would retrieve from a donor, only 6.5 of them would end up being babies. 5 at this age group, 4, 3, 2, and 1 in the eldest age group. So pretty poor efficiencies for fresh or fresh and post-frozen embryo utilization. We're rerunning those numbers, and they've all inched up quite notably. So that'll be an abstract for 2014 in Hawaii for any of you that make it across the pond out in the Pacific. So just, you know, sobering thought that we're still not as efficient as we'd like to be. In terms of attrition, it's pretty easy once you look at every step of the way, all the way from ovarian stim through fertilization, embryo selection and growth, and to eventually reaching this point for consideration, do we transfer or vitrify, or which to transfer or otherwise. Ultimately, post-fresh transfer, you know, it's quite possible that our outcomes are pretty limited. And I would certainly like to promote the idea that we consider taking a cryo-all approach at this stage. And I probably have very flimsy data to show that. But I guess it was a light switch that went on for me when we looked at our 2011 data. Here from Shady Grove, and interestingly we found that if you look at all age groups, our FET transfer cycles were doing better than our fresh transfer cycles across the board. Now, with the caveat that not all patients have embryos vitrified, but maybe they should, that perhaps you know, we could be much more comfortable about the idea of total cryopreservation occurring in any given IVF cycle. And I'll come back to that in a little moment, but for some reason I threw this slide in here. So let's just backtrack, and for those of you, and there are still quite a number of holdouts even in the US who are very comfortable and have pretty reasonably successful slow freezing programs. But I would certainly put it to you that you might consider taking the leap from the frozen state to the vitrified state, as illustrated pictorially over here on the right. This was a picture that Jürgen Lieberman and I put together many moons ago in 2005, but it just simply shows you the difference in approach. Many of you have probably gone into the details of this, but slow freezing is really just a very fine dance to achieve ice crystal formation without too much disruption in the egg or the embryo itself, using a programmable freezer, versus the ultra-rapid cooling system with vitrification, where you're trying to obviate and eliminate any formation of ice. And indeed, as we've gone back, and there's some very elegant work done by real cryobiologists, not like me who's only ever played one on TV, is that actually in the slow freeze process, that the fine dance that you achieve is to actually achieve extracellular freezing, ice crystal formation, but in fact in successful slow freezing, you're actually generating, by sucking out just enough water from the intracellular matrix, and not too much, otherwise you'll kill the cell off, but you actually achieve a state of vitrification within the cell intracellularly. So all these years we were slow freezing, we were actually vitrifying, and there are much better people than me who've made that statement before, but I think it's always very good for all of us to be mindful of that. So to achieve routine vitrification, I believe has taken a good 10 years for us to perfect, certainly since I got into it routinely clinically in 2002, 2003, but certainly the outcomes have justified the effort. Here, looking at blastocyst cryopreservation, and of course this is wonderful retrospective data, but the little red circle shows you implantation rate, actual live birth rate per blastocyst transfer in the cryo slow frozen program, 17, doubling to 34% in this data through 2011, following vitrification of blasts versus slow frozen. And again, if we dissect a lot of that data and actually look at not only survival of the embryos, but the actual cellular totality survival is much higher in this red bar here, where you get 100% cellular survival with vitrification versus the much more common intracellular or cellular loss following slow freeze in blue. So I think overall, in the context of not just total survival, but you get in the multicellular embryos much higher rates of total survival using vitrification. And interestingly, although we were phasing out many day 7 observations in the labs I work with, and certainly single-step medium has virtually eliminated it, but nevertheless, if we look at the ability for vitrification relative to the day of blastocyst formation, you'll see that you're still getting quite a healthy outcome from blastocysts, pretty good quality ones, but vitrified as late as on day 7 following vitrification versus slow freezing. So sort of making it a justifiable rescue of these very slow forming blastocysts on day 7. I'm not a reproductive endocrinologist, don't claim to be, but certainly somebody such as Bruce Shapiro in Las Vegas has been beating the drum for many years now over the ability, principally using 2PN cryopreservation, to take all of his transfers into the FET state with subsequent culture of those 2PNs. But a little more recently, he certainly compared the ability of cryo of day 6 forming blastocysts to do much better in FET cycles versus the fresh. And certainly there's a movement, I believe, certainly in Japan it's extremely strong, for all embryo transfers to move into the thaw cycles rather than to do fresh freezes. Data I'm not going to present because I think it's going to be presented as an abstract somewhere, so anyway, it's a little off topic, but certainly having looked at our retrospective data at Shady Grove over the years, we did find that we did have a diminishment of implantation rates in those patients with elevated progesterone on the day of HCG, and we now have a pretty routine cutoff at over 1.5 nanograms per mil to move to a freeze-all cycle. Now it gets a little complicated with insurance markets where patients may lose out on a cycle if we don't do a transfer in that fresh cycle. So what we've moved to do in those cycles is, if we're driven to put back at least one embryo fresh, we'll choose from a second tier blastocyst and perhaps vitrify the better quality blastocyst. In general, endometrial receptivity, I would posture, is pretty much always disturbed in a controlled ovarian hyperstim cycle, so what the heck. And just in general, we all still wrestle with management of our endometrial receptivity. And this is some interesting data, which actually looks at the cryo program. And this is not a controlled study. And I know the endometrium folks yell at me about this, but we do have a bunch of docs who don't always, a smaller group of docs who haven't conformed to standard protocols at Shady Grove, and they've added in their data using vaginal progesterone versus IM progesterone in thaw cycles. And consistently, whether in the slow freeze program here or the VIT program, we seem to have consistently higher outcomes using IM in our program. Now, I'm not saying that that's definitive, and it all depends on how you manage your cycles, and other people can perhaps use vaginal progesterone successfully, but it's always interesting to me that that's certainly one area of operations which is somewhat out of my control, but is so key in being able to manage a successful FET cycle. I threw this slide in here, and it was just some shots off the laptop that I happened to have from a few days ago. And a lot of people, pretty much anything, egg, 2PN, cleavage, blast, if you froze it, it's going to mess. Even with vitrification, you're going to get some level of hardening of the zona. And you can prove that to yourself. You can take a fresh egg, for example, and vitrify an egg and warm it up, and then dump it in some protease and time how long it takes for the zona to dissolve. And invariably, if there's been some cryo involved, the zona takes a little bit longer to disappear. So it sort of makes sense that if you've compromised the zona to some extent, drill a hole in it. And this isn't a very good angle because it's rolled, but you probably can't see. But on this blastocyst here, it's rolled around, and the hole is actually a slice right the way across there. It's almost like capping about a third of the zona pellucida on the left-hand side there at 9 o'clock. And when it's still in the shrunk state, we basically cap the whole zona. So you give a big old hole for the blastocyst to come out of. So big fan of assisted hatching with anything cryo. But here's some fresh data, and I'm remiss in never having done a study on frozen thawed blastocysts. I did generate some data a while back, but this was just some very early data when we first got into extended culture back in 98, early 99, presented in, I don't know, somewhere Prague or whatever, back in the day. But this was looking at how could we improve our day 6 blast formations, actually get them to implant better. Well, lo and behold, laser hatching here improves the outcome quite significantly in terms of pregnancy, if not quite so in terms of implantation compared to day 5 fresh control transfers. And then some data which, and I'm wonderful, you've all heard of randomized controlled trials, RCTs. Well, my favorites are ruts, and I get stuck in ruts constantly, which are retrospective uncontrolled trials. But some unpublished data that we generated in-house from slow freeze blasts back in 99, 2000, we showed that across the board, and I didn't publish it because for whatever reason, the IRB and all kinds of, there was an IRB in place, but the consents weren't done properly, so it's like, to heck with that, I just forgot it. But didn't forget it, didn't publish it, but the assisted hatching in this group of patients post-thaw improved remarkably from 19% to 31% following laser hatching of the blastocyst post thawing. Certainly I would mention that pre-VIT, any blastocyst, you're gonna use a laser or something to make the blastocyst shrink pre-vitrification. It improves consistency of outcome. You're gonna use the laser then anyway. I've actually had some programs go in and do a hatch size hole and punch the trophectoderm to collapse the blastocyst at that time. There is a good controlled study here, 2006 from Valban et al., looking at hatching on cleavage, day 2 frozen embryos, and they showed that assisted hatching certainly, and I'm not going to show any of the negative data out there in the literature, but just to prove my point that hatching of anything cryopreserved is a beneficial thing to do. Let's take a little more general look here and some data of how over the years we've decreased in 2004 down to 2013, early-ish here, the number of embryos that we actually transfer. Meanwhile, the pregnancy rate has gone up in the blue lines there. But the interesting stuff to me is, and I straighten this bottom line out a bit, instead of doing FETs per fresh transfers, I actually looked at the balance of FETs per overall IVF cycles initiated during this period, and you'll see that it's gone up. That is the number of thaw cycles undertaken. It's not necessarily transfers, but actual thaw cycles initiated has gone up from just over 10% to actually at the end of 2013, this figure was knocking on 40%. That is, of all procedures done in the program at Shady Grove in 2013, 14% were FETs. And I'm predicting that by 2015, that year of operations, we'll probably go past 50% mark. So FETs will start outnumbering fresh transfers. And I think that's for a variety of reasons, but I think it certainly indicates how we, and this is where I start singing the Frozen song for all of you. The cold never bothered me anyway, and I'll try not to hit the high notes, but favorite movie. Yeah, I have young kids, so, oh, gee. Certainly, it's very fascinating, and I don't have any sensation left in my fingers anymore from many, many years of cryo in the lab. But there's a whole plethora of carriers, and, you know, I'm not up here to promote one over the other, except to say that, and just this is a whole slide, there's just, I mean, there was just this kind of spewing of different technological approaches to how to vitrify stuff, but ultimately we just use an open carrier, a little bit like this up the top here. You can see this is an old-fashioned cryotop, but we favor open vit carriers, and that's not a very good draw down there, but anyway, we're not got into that, but open exposure to liquid nitrogen. So let's just look at that, and you've probably seen this slide in one shape or another, but simply all this says is that in comparing sort of closed straw systems, cryotip, which is a closed system, you get a much lower cooling rate and warming rate, indeed, from those closed systems versus all these open systems down here, especially the cryotop, being a method of choice in terms of favored extreme cooling rates, and perhaps, as we've learned more recently in the last 5-6 years, that the warming rates are probably even more important than the cooling rates. A kind of boring but extremely important comment on the fact that regardless of how I have no commercial interest in this system, but you know, we've always used Brady labelers and been very anal about how we label any of our cryoed eggs or embryos in our program. And I cannot tell you the number of times I've been approached to be a legal expert in issues where there's problems with labeling and so forth, compromise and loss of information during the cryo process. So anyway, just enough said on that. Get your labeling straight and make sure it stays there for eternity. Certainly the different vit carriers here using embryos, comparison across the board, and it really doesn't matter too much other than to cite from this particular study, and I've lost my little mouse, not that it matters, you've got the red highlight, but that the cryotip in this particular study actually showed a significant compromise in terms of increased DNA fragmentation following VIT in a closed carrier with slower cooling and warming. Here, an egg study showing compromise using slow freeze of the actual proteomic and metabolomic profiles relative to, come on mouse, move, where are you? Maybe it's gone off screen. Huh? Oh, it is? I've lost track of it. Ah, there we are. I thought that was a fly, but yeah, no, but anyway. Slow freeze having a significantly compromising impact on both the proteome and the metabolome, when vitrification has a profile much more comparable with regular fresh eggs. What's the big deal about having a closed system for freezing your embryos in? Okay, I've done like 33 minutes, so give me another 8 minutes and stop snoozing in the back there. What's the big deal about closed systems? Well, I won't go into this, but there's always this. Has anybody ever seen that wonderful, it's gone out of my head, it's a Japanese anime cartoon where these little soot mites up in the attic? Well, this publication has these wonderful soot mites present in every bath of liquid nitrogen, and they will glom onto your openly exposed. I'm just kidding, okay? But the point of having a closed vitrification system is you avoid these evil soot mites that lurk in your liquid nitrogen. But like suddenly, and any of you that follow Embryo Mail in recent years, I've actually stopped reading it most times unless somebody says, okay, read Embryo Mail, there's something interesting on it. I got sick of the constant debate over the open-closed system and how we're all going to be closed down, and the FDA was going to come in sort of large sort of alien suits because of all the contamination we were creating. Does anybody realize that for, 25, 30 years we've been freezing stuff, embryos principally, but eggs to some extent, in vials and straws that leak? Okay, CBS Systems made a valiant approach to a closed system, which pretty much works, but everything else leaks in those hideous vats of liquid nitrogen in your labs that never get cleaned out, from year to year. Nobody sweated that. So, okay, enough said on that. So I'm just an open vit fan, and I'm all about closing the system once you've actually had open exposure to liquid nitrogen. So if you want to do an open closed system, I'm fine with that. But I'm getting off track here. Move forward. What's important about this slide? Secure labeling. Yeah, all the things that can go wrong with open closed systems. All say, yeah, okay, that's kind of boring. FDA, ultimately, this is the Bible by which we operate, and the FDA, bottom line, focuses on minimization of disease transmission. And if you're so concerned, how come they recently gave approval, 510K clearance to the CryoLock, which is an open exposure system. And CryoTop, albeit in a certain guise, is now FDA approved, and there's Cryotech open system, which will be FDA approved quite soon. So it's kind of off the FDA's radar, and in the grand scheme of things, ending up getting one of those soot mites infecting your egg or embryo at a level which is going to be problematic in terms of disease transmission. It's like being hit by a bloody meteorite. When you screw around with closed vit systems, you make it more difficult technologically, and you run the risk much more of killing your bloody embryo or losing it. Now, isn't that a much greater risk? So, that lecture's over with. Thank goodness I didn't get too many gin and tonics tonight. I'll just close out with egg cryo, why it's so good, and you've heard this lecture a lot, but interestingly, it's taken off, and I was first involved. I won't go into the history of it, you all want to go home. Fertility preservation, increasing area of use. I'm much more comfortable with egg vit now in being able to say to somebody who's about to go through onc therapy, you know, that, yeah, we can give a good shot at giving you something with being able to vitrify your eggs. Increasingly, and certainly there's some large programs in Manhattan who figured this out years ago, but there's a lot of business in elective fertility preservation. You know, the whole biological clock thing is starting to really kick in. We've even been approached by people transgender operations to have their eggs frozen before they get it on with the, well, okay, let's not go there. But, you know, it's an expanding universe of clinical operations. Donor egg bank, as I kind of predicted in 1996, would be the area of operation where we really cut our teeth and figured out how egg vit would work really well. That and, you know, legal issues in Italy. Big area. Elective limited insemination. We're seeing that increasingly. You all know the issue, frozen embryos, too many embryos. They don't want the extra embryos, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or they get divorced, heaven forbid. And you end up with these sort of orphaned embryos. Wouldn't it be much better if somebody had control of their reproduction and only limited the insemination of number of eggs to 2 or 3 and vitrified the rest of her eggs? We're seeing that increasingly. And I'm dwelling on this because it took till after she passed away for me to come up with this acronym, but my ex-wife used to get so pissed off with all the silly acronyms that we came up with in IVF. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2010, so this is a little posthumous shout out to my ex-wife, Ellie. So don't forget that. Failure to find sperm, no problem. Religious, personal reasons, yeah, very good to egg freeze and OHSS if you want to go that route. Okay, I'm going to run through this very quickly. Efficiencies of egg freezing. Back in 1997, I was at the New York Reproductive Society meeting and was yelled at because somebody did the math and said we were reporting on 5 babies from slow frozen eggs, and somebody did the math and said that's nearly 100 eggs you had to destroy to get 1 baby. Well, guess what? Even in fresh IVF, our efficiencies are not that good, yeah, or it's still not so good that back in 97, we were probably doing worse than that routinely in our fresh IVF across all platforms. But that sort of stuck with me, and this slide is very nice in being able to illustrate, you know, how inefficient we were back in the early days of slow freezing through the dark ages. I actually went and hung out with Chris Chen in Flinders Uni in Adelaide back in 1986 when he got those reports. So I have a long history of being involved in this. Okay, boring. Slow freeze now being totally replaced by VIT. This is a great publication from Nicole Noyes, which was very pivotal in, so I hear, actually getting the wheels at ASRM to grind forward with taking the experimental label away. First VIT pregnancy in 99. This is an important slide. It may not look very important, but here you'll see an egg actually this is post-VIT, and this is an egg post-VIT. And you'll see this state. You see all those little vacuoles under the zona, just beneath the egg membrane. That's a much more common outcome from slow freeze than this is. And eggs can recover from that. You won't often see that outcome routinely, but it's certainly illustrative of the routine, more common non-lethal damage that can occur to your egg. So once you get into egg cryo or egg vit specifically, even though you might think you're doing quite a good job and getting reasonable survival, you'll still see hiccups along the developmental path. Fail to FERT, fail to cleave well, and ultimate test of blast formation is absolutely key. This just shows you in terms of survival how things have ramped up in terms of vitrification of eggs versus slow freeze from some data here. But I think what this doesn't illustrate, nobody's illustrated because egg cryo in general is an all or nothing thing anyway. It either survives or it doesn't. Well, actually, if it survives, I think, much more routinely. There was sort of cryptic damage more routinely following the slow freeze approach. Advantages of donor egg banking: no synchronization, no waiting generally, quick donor selection, quarantine possible, we won't mention that, egg for egg, comparable to fresh donation, and I think that's debatable, but nevertheless it comes close, reduces surplus embryo cryo, and is cheaper. In fact, this is the paper from Anna Koba, which shows equivalency between use of fresh and vitrified eggs. Great paper. And this was kind of like our trial by fire. For many years we had an extremely successful, and it continues, 2- and 3-way fresh donor egg share program at Shady Grove. It took me a long time to get them to buy into a donor egg bank to use some of those surplus eggs, but proof of principle for the first couple of years of ops, and we were able to get pretty reasonable outcomes with vitrified eggs. Shout out to the new venture which span off from Shady Grove, Donor Egg Bank USA Partners, and there's more even than that list now. But this was the first 6 months of operations, and amazingly, the delivered outcomes, in spite of everything, proved to be better than I thought we might do. With high efficiency, we use on average a cohort of 6 donor eggs. And this data is a little bit more recent, looking at operations 2012 through spring of this year in the multi-site experience in Donor Egg Bank. And it's still looking pretty good. Interestingly, we made some changes in the first quarter of this year for significant improved consistency across operations, and I think we're inching up the bottom line finally to ongoing outcomes above the 50% outcome rate per thaw, which there's a lot of hard sweat and blood and tears in that. And this slide, basically this paper put together was a meta-analysis, but it actually started to consider the power of autologous fertility preservation. And certainly as egg freezing has gone much more mainstream in recent years, and in fact this idea of transgender persons pre-transition was put together, thrown out there originally by Sarah Richards, who wrote this book, Motherhood Rescheduled. And we may not seem to have too many beauties in Atlanta, but I know one at home is certainly on track to have some fertility preservation if I have anything to do with it. Just looking at some of our data with autologous thaws, and we're going to have a lot more data to present at ASRM, so I can't show you that data, but our initial data here looking very healthy with patients' own eggs. There's a whole mixture of FERT-Pres, cancer, some ELI in there, an egg vit, an emergent egg vit cases, no sperm and so forth, all clinically very interesting. Sweet spot, gosh, it's a tough sell, stopping those 42 and 43-year-olds coming in to have their eggs freeze, but there's definite distinct sweet spot for when it's probably most appropriately applied. But we do, for example, that's just more data, a little bit expanded, same sort of stuff, autologous eggs. But what we're focusing now is when we're trying to talk to these patients about giving them realistic outcomes with their own eggs, is we kind of shoot for 20 eggs in the can, and depending on age, and this isn't a very good illustration yet, but we're certainly working on an algorithm for age and the ability to end up with 20 reasonable eggs in the pot. And as is usually the hallmark at Shady Grove and so forth, we're looking to find value for service, we hope, but also try to be as transparent and as accessible as possible in terms of assurance of outcomes. So not quite money back, but certainly sharing the risk with our patients as best we can. I know it's a little crass to show money, but it's what drives our industry. But I think that egg freezing has certainly come of age across the board. That's just a comparison of the various programs, and I'm almost about to shut up, but I'm going to berate all the MDs in the audience. Is just because you can freeze or vitrify anything at any stage and come up with some incredibly complicated scenarios in what we do, and it's all good, but just make sure your orders are very clear in terms of what the heck you want to have done. Certainly in the era of having 6 blastocysts cryopreserved, a patient wanting to bank her embryos, and then come in for, gather more embryos. Then you've got 6 frozen blasts to warm up, biopsy. Should we warm them up on day 5 and throw in, the 2 blasts that form on day 5 from our fresh cycle and get an overnight result? And then we're going to have more the next day to vitrify or biopsy and send out. It can be a pretty complicated picture. We've had 3 or 4 cycles with banked embryos, keeping track as you send them off. In our database, they were all numbered 1 through X in the first cycle, well, they were all 1 through X in the next cycle, making sure that you track all those things. That can get incredibly complex, and the ability for the double-edged sword of the wonders of cryopreservation is they can make the complexity of chain of custody that more complex, and the risk potential for screwing up is enormous. And I've pretty much seen it all in terms of the wrong embryos being thawed with genetic disease put back and pregnancies initiated and stopped. I'm not saying in my necessary personal clinics, but I've certainly been involved and seen this happen out there. But, be wary of that. Make sure that your lab has a very clear understanding, and don't screw around at the last minute and change the orders unless you can clarify with your lab that it's doable in whatever circumstance. So, okay, enough pontificating. Did we learn anything? Well, I'd like to think yes. ESAT promoted by successful VIT. FET outcomes post-VIT at least as good as fresh embryos, and I think certainly there's a strong case to perhaps do all FETs. We've actually separated out operations at our main lab in Rockville. We have an FET suite. And then we have our fresh IVF operations elsewhere. And that way, because I'm not very good in public, they can do all that transfer stuff downstairs, and I'll just mess around with the other lab thing. But not all embryologists are like me. But, you can imagine eventually you could set up the process where patients just come in, retrievals generate embryos, disappear and come back in a thaw cycle. I think that's possibly a very realistic scenario. Donor egg experience, very positive, very convenient. No sperm, no problem. Egg vit, PGS, PGD, don't sweat, please. Just vitrify everything. FERT preservation now a real promise, not just a hope. Moral of the story, chill out, okay? And certainly I'd like to thank all my regular gigs, Shady Grove, Donor Egg Bank USA, fertility centers, New England, reproductive specialists, New York, Mississippi, Georgia Reproductive, and Zytex. But most of all, I'd really like to thank my family for putting up with me. So, and thank you for being here. Hey, I spoke for 51 minutes, so I'm sorry. I ran 10 minutes over what I said.
Thank you so much, Mike. Questions? Dr. Joshi.
What is your experience of collapsing the blastocyst before vitrifying? What is your opinion?
Yeah, collapsing blastocysts before vitrification. I've always had access to lasers. So all we do is we'll throw the embryo up in the dish that it's cultured in, and we'll just pop the trophectoderm just away, obviously, from the inner cell mass, throw it up in the incubator next to where our vitrification workstation, and by the time we've got set up for the vit, pull it out, pretty much they're always invariably collapsed.
You do it routinely?
Oh yes, all pre-blast vit will collapse. Other people, you know, I have people routinely poke them with ICSI needles, and you know, people have done studies in pulling out blastocytic fluid to see if they can find interesting DNA fragmentation to give them a jump start on aneuploidy screening and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of things. People can be very creative. Some people just use a 0.2 molar sucrose or a 0.1 molar sucrose, solution. 0.2 works a little faster, but you know, I think that sort of messes with what you're trying to do with your VIT setup. So I wouldn't recommend that. Yeah, but laser's king, queen.
I have a question for the group. How many of you have patients who say, hey, embryo donation, can I be the recipient of donor embryos from an embryo bank? And how many of you are approached by any patients for that? Pretty commonly, you say? So I guess with your wonderful presentation tonight, truly about the biography of cryopreservation, you have embryos that have been cryopreserved in any number of ways. Mm-hmm. What do you advise us to advise our patients about the quality of embryos in a bank from a generic bank?
It's a kind of thorny issue, actually. The Shady Grove, in that experience, and don't forget I have lots of different programs I work with, big, small, indifferent. Shady Grove experience has, because it's such a big, you know, it's like Jupiter or something, and we get many, many more embryos brought in than we send out. And over the years, we have had some disastrous scenarios in terms of, you know, labeling and getting the number of what they said they send in actually being it, or even it being what they said they sent in. So we're very wary about the source of these embryos, and that's made Shady Grove, from a risk standpoint, very leery about getting into embryo donation. Now, if they're in-house frozen, we can obviously, we have a much better handle on the quality of those embryos. And actually, I have a little kind of side charity, if you will, where we ship those embryos out to my operations in Atlanta, GRS, who uses some of the Shady Grove donated embryos. Now, I think it's a wonderful, don't get me wrong, I think embryo donation is one of the best bangs for the buck in assisted reproduction if you require an embryo. But there are some significant issues. You get people, yeah, I mean, 12 2PNs doesn't guarantee a baby. But that said, you know, G.W. Bush held up one of our frozen thawed blastocysts in Congress in 2005 from GRS, and it was one of our frozen blasts, and that went from Georgia up to Richmond, Virginia, and it was a Virginia baby, and that was a very proud moment. Nobody knew it except us, but point being that, you know, I think it's a powerful tool. I think if you can come close to feeling comfortable with the group that you're receiving them from, that's fine. But you start getting them from the embryo adoption agencies, I start to sweat that enormously, because, you know, we have had some rough experiences from that when you don't know the exact source and quality. And the tragic process of counseling the couple or individual involved, and then you have nothing to transfer. Or you can't feel comfortable that what you got, you should be transferring. Do you know what I mean? So, I don't know, that's a tough call. I think if you develop a good relationship, I'm happier to receive from another lab, even if it's not one I know well. I will get to know it if needs be. Of course, the first thing is I jump on sart.org and check out and see what they look like. That's not always fair, because I know working in small programs, sometimes you don't always have the best looking outcomes, because, you know, you're right in the vagaries of your patient quality in small numbers. I don't know. It's for every clinic to decide what its risk tolerance is, and also the tolerance of dealing with a distraught and disappointed recipient.
Right. Questions from the group? I have others, but I just thought the whole process in ART with the emergence of effective cryopreservation, sort of like the Food Network, has deconstructed the process, which has more moving parts, as you so eloquently described. There's more sites for error, along the way. I know you used bloody a lot when you were describing this stuff,
whoops.
but by the same token, when we have to report outcomes, the Wyden Act of 1992 and the CDC's mission to follow that is becoming very sclerotic, very rigid. And the way in which we need to report outcomes is not being, or the methodology of the reporting process is not keeping up with the changes in technology. So with our egg bank, we're running into difficulty reporting to the CDC our egg thaw outcomes. And I want to know, you are mega size, what your experience is and how you are reporting.
We really, it's interesting because I think what you're referring to, well, it's egg cryo as well, but specifically the embryo banking and the denominator involved in the ultimate outcome of a healthy live-born child. It's sometimes, it's very difficult to know what the denominator is in that equation. But I think, SART in particular, and I know that they're driving CDC to make it much more transparent, and for 2014, for sure, for sure 2015, but I think it's pretty sure for 2014, if I listened to David Ball correctly twice already this year, the denominator will be per retrieval, so that you can do 4 retrievals, but until you hit a transfer and make a baby, the denominator is going to be 4. So if you get a pregnancy, that's 25%. You may get you have to get 4 pregnancies for those 4 retrievals to make it 100%. And we all get hung up on percentage success rates. But I think while it's a complex arena to report on in a transparent, non-commercially spun way, I think, SART, and I know they're dragging CDC is well on board with it. The ability to open up this pie and see what's inside it and how it ticks is going to be more complicated for the patients. It's going to take more counseling, perhaps with your patients. But I think we'll be in a better place in the next 2 or 3 years in being able to say, you want what? Okay, well, we'll take you down this path and show you what you're really looking at in terms of successful outcomes. And, I think Shady Grove, we try and be as upfront and transparent, whatever that awful word is, as possible. Because, I like to sleep at nights, and I know, my docs and everyone I work with there and the other programs I work with, we don't want to oversell and underdeliver. I think that's what it comes down to. And if you have some financial shenanigans in the background, I then start raising my little social medicine, because, I come from Britain, so I don't think nationalized medicine is quite as bad as it seems. But I tend to be more about patient care than making money, and I know that that's not always the right thing to focus on, because if you don't make enough money, you don't stay open, and I've seen that happen for sure in some clinics. So, I don't know. It's an interesting time to be in our business, that's for sure. But I think we'll be in a more open, transparent market in the next year or 2.
Well, one more thing I had, every time when I look out into the audience and I see Dr. Krawitz, I start to think about, you've given us all these outcomes based on an egg. Tell us the influence of the sperm on the cryotechnology outcomes.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it
Steve.
remains pretty profound. Yeah, and that's one of the tough things, particularly you get into any of you who've done enough donor egg business, you'll get couples come in and you'll have challenges on the male side of the equation, and the assumption that, you know, it's bada bing, bada bong, and you're going to have 80% take-home baby rate every time. Well, no, that can be significantly drugged down by the quality of the male gamete. And, you know, occasionally we have to advise some of these extreme male factors where you're microdissection, finding sort of sperm-like objects, slobs as we call them, and injecting them into very healthy donor eggs and not generating viable embryos. Well, you know, maybe you need to look elsewhere. So the sperm is definitely involved in the equation. You know, we dabble with Pixie some, and we have any number of anecdotal cases of repeat failures, and we've come back, and we're not talking for male factors here, we're talking about some cryptic issue in terms of selecting the potentially competent sperm, and it's very anecdotal data, but sometimes that seems to work out pretty well. Pixie is just a hyaluronan binding trick. You have a little ICSI dish which has some little dots of hyaluronan on the bottom, and you'll just layer your sperm suspension over it pre-ICSI, and you'll just select out those that are motile. Generally these are non-male factor patients, but they swim and bind, and sort of is in essence, so goes the theory, that they sort of prove their functionality to a higher level by not only being able to be motile, but actually to bind in a physiological manner with the same substance they would do so as if they were, you know, getting to the egg. I'm not promoting that, but that's just one of the things that's got into our culture the last 5-6 years. So, but yes, we're certainly much more cognizant of not quite getting into IMSI, but we certainly work very hard to analyze, and with our video monitors, we're able to pick up on significant vacuolation of sperm heads, so we try and minimize that as much as possible, and certainly focus on the morphology of sperm a lot more than perhaps I used to, you know, 10-15 years ago. So just because it's a sperm doesn't mean to say it's, you know, going to work.
Have there been any long-term follow-ups yet on the children?
From ICSI?
No.
Oh, from
frozen embryo transfer.
Frozen egg? No, there's I think inevitably there's going to be some studies out of Denmark which says that we're doing really bad things. Sorry, I'm just joking. Some of you, there's a paper on embryo cryopreservation. It always seems to come out of a Danish national study that says we're doing evil things. And there was a report recently for any of you, what was it, in The Lancet? Where was it? It came out in March, I think it was. It was a Danish study comparing cryopreserved embryo outcomes versus fresh embryo transfers versus a not very well controlled national cohort of in vivo fertilized babies. And the bottom line of the study was that the cryopreserved embryo outcomes were giving small for gestational age outcomes, and we're just coming off the fear that IVF fresh transfers in general are giving us large for gestational age outcomes. And so it kind of seemed to me like, well, that's a good thing. That suggests greater physiologic growth following in an unstimulated cycle. But anyway, nobody has done a great deal of work to follow up on long-term studies with egg cryopreservation. I know that there's been some attempt to do so in Italy, but you know, I've not seen a report from that, because they have, in terms of large experience, they have the largest historic experience of outcomes from egg cryo. although a large percentage of their outcome is from slow freezing. So certainly the metabolomic and the proteomic profiles from egg vitrification certainly strongly suggest that we see much less compromise of the egg quality from that approach. So I suspect that vitrification in general is going to be less problematic than slow freezing. And with slow freezing, you know, again, like this Danish study, they were saying that there was no real issue other than that they were citing, no, I got that totally wrong. It was the cryo babies were giving large birth syndrome, versus small for gestational age following fresh transfer of, sorry, I got that totally wrong. I don't see that as a problem. And all that data was based on slow frozen embryo data in any event. So I see vitrification being even less compromising if there were any kind of cryptic problem in those offspring. So, but then you have to dissect it all out because you're looking at an infertile population in any event. So it's going to keep, you know, population biostatisticians, you know, busy for many, many years. And, you know, I just, you know, I'm very hopeful. I keep a passport in my back pocket and a one-way ticket to Paraguay, you know, if the shit really hits the fan one of these days. So.
Watch out for parasites. I think there was a commonly quoted observational study by Noyes back in 2009 or 2010. It was around 900 outcomes where they did not see an increased risk of birth defects with egg fit, but I don't know.
But that was just short term in
Yes.
terms of neonatal stuff and yeah, early, but long term developmental stuff. I don't know. They might all be geniuses. We could always get positive about. Why always see the bad downside of this? So,
but anyway, well, I have a few thank yous. First and foremost to you, Dr. Tucker, for taking time out to share your
Thanks for coming,
great
everyone, by the way.
insights. And also to those that have helped to make this. Also for those in our industry support who helped to make our series over the last, 15 years or longer possible. Our friends from Genesis Genetics, put your hands in the back. Thank you so much, and continue to help us with our PGS, PGD, and PG whatever. And our folks from Fairing, and also from Good Start. Well, and then activists. Back. Thank you so much. And also from Merck.
Okay.
And also, if I can go through Freedom, and also with Smith Medical, I'm looking onto the group, and then also with Hologic and Walgreens. But thank you all so much. And I need to thank a few other people, and not least, but if not most at the same time, Alyssa Jones, you are once again wonderful to put this together. Yeah, we'll have alcohol next time. And Rich and Dale, our videographers, we're going to start to put a playlist with a new website up and start to have these videos available to our membership and have access to review them. Starting with Dr. Woodruff's talk over the next years, we'll just be adding to that. But Lucky Airlines, you rock. But thank you all tonight. Enjoy, socialize. I'm so glad you're together. And it's so fun to be able to bring everyone together to share ideas, thoughts, and just company. Thanks again. Thank you.